The German soldier stood motionless at the entrance to the shower room, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hot steam billowed from the chrome fixtures. Clean white tiles gleamed under electric lights. The American guard gestured for him to enter, but Obergefreiter Klaus Müller couldn't move. He'd spent the last 3 months crawling through frozen Italian mud, watching friends die from dysentery, and eating moldy bread that made his stomach cramp for hours. The Geneva Convention pamphlet he'd been issued in 1941 promised humane treatment for prisoners of war. He'd thrown it away after hearing stories from the Eastern Front. This couldn't be real. The water pressure alone seemed impossible. Hot water, not lukewarm, not ice-cold from a bucket, actually hot. Müller's hands trembled as he reached toward the faucet. Behind him, 20 other German prisoners waited in line, all wearing the same expression of stunned confusion. They'd surrendered 2 days ago in North Africa, expecting execution or, at best, starvation in a desert camp. Instead, they'd been given medical examinations, delousing treatments, and clean American uniforms with PW stenciled on the back. One guard leaned against the doorframe, chewing gum and reading a comic book. "What are you waiting for?" the guard asked in broken German. "You got 15 minutes before chow." Chow, the American word for food. Müller had heard rumors, impossible rumors about prison camps where German soldiers gained weight, where they ate 3 times a day, where the Red Cross boxes actually contained chocolate and cigarettes instead of sawdust and propaganda. He stepped into the shower. The hot water hit his skin, and Klaus Müller, veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, hardened by 3 years of brutal warfare, started to cry. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. These men expected concentration camps. They expected punishment. They expected the same brutal treatment German camps inflicted on Soviet prisoners, where mortality rates reached 60%. What they got, instead, violated every assumption they'd been taught about their enemies. Camp commanders across America operated under a simple directive from the War Department: follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. Not because of humanitarian concerns, though those existed. Not because Americans were inherently more civilized, though many believed that. The reason was coldly pragmatic. American POWs held in Germany would be treated the same way Germans were treated in America. Reciprocity became the prisoner's lifeline. But the Geneva Convention established only minimum standards. The United States exceeded them dramatically. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Como in Mississippi, and 650 other facilities across the continental United States, German soldiers discovered an America that contradicted everything Joseph Goebbels had told them. They weren't beaten. They weren't starved. They weren't worked to death in slave labor conditions. They were given steak dinners. The cognitive dissonance shattered men. Propaganda painted Americans as mongrel race mixers too weak and decadent to fight effectively. German soldiers called them Ami with contempt. Then those same soldiers arrived at camps where black guards treated them with professional courtesy, where Jewish doctors administered medical care without revenge, where farm families invited work details into their homes for Sunday dinner. The disconnect between expectation and reality created a psychological earthquake that would reshape how 425,000 men understood the world. Most German POWs captured by American forces came from North Africa, Italy, or France. The journey to American camps began with uncertainty and fear. Wehrmacht training included horror stories about Allied prison camps. Soviet camps were death sentences. British camps were cold and meager. American camps were unknown quantities, made worse by Nazi propaganda, about American brutality and race-based hatred. Luftwaffe pilot Werner Burkhardt surrendered after his Messerschmitt was shot down over Tunisia in March 1943. He expected immediate execution. Instead, American medics treated his burns, gave him morphine for the pain, and transported him to a field hospital where doctors saved his right arm. 3 weeks later, he boarded a Liberty ship bound for New York Harbor. The ship's hold contained 800 German prisoners. They slept in hammocks strung between support beams. American guards distributed life jackets and explained emergency procedures in case of U-boat attack. The men laughed bitterly at that detail. German U-boats attacking a ship full of German prisoners. The war's irony wasn't lost on anyone. During the 10-day crossing, prisoners received 3 meals daily: coffee with breakfast, meat with lunch and dinner. The portions weren't generous, but they were consistent and edible. Men who'd lived on Kommissbrot and watery soup for months couldn't believe it. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others ate until they vomited, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle real nutrition. When the ship entered New York Harbor, guards allowed prisoners on deck to see the Statue of Liberty. Burkhardt stood at the rail, watching the Manhattan skyline emerge from morning fog. Buildings taller than anything in Berlin, thousands of cars on elevated highways, ships of every size moving through busy channels. No bomb damage, no rubble, no signs of war at all. America hadn't been touched. The implications terrified him more than any propaganda could. Germany was fighting an enemy with unlimited resources, untouched industry, and no devastated cities. His homeland was doomed. He knew it in that moment, watching American abundance roll past in waves of steel and concrete and seemingly endless prosperity. The trains carried prisoners inland from East Coast ports. Wehrmacht soldiers pressed their faces against windows, staring at American farmland rolling past in geometric precision. Iowa cornfields stretched to the horizon. Kansas wheat rippled like golden oceans. Texas ranches sprawled across landscapes larger than some European nations. Everything seemed impossibly big, impossibly prosperous, impossibly untouched by war. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, processing began with paperwork. American officers filled out forms in triplicate, documenting each prisoner's name, rank, serial number, and capture location. The bureaucratic efficiency impressed German soldiers trained in similar systems. But the treatment surprised them. Medical examinations came next. Doctors checked for diseases, injuries, and malnutrition. Most prisoners arrived in poor health after months of combat and deprivation. American medical staff treated everything: infected wounds, dental problems, vitamin deficiencies, parasites, respiratory infections. One German soldier arrived with untreated shrapnel wounds from Sicily. American surgeons removed the metal fragments, gave him antibiotics, and sent him to recovery with a prescription for pain medication. Pain medication for a prisoner of war. Then came the showers. Camp Concordia had been built specifically to house POWs with modern plumbing throughout. Hot water wasn't rationed, neither was soap. Prisoners could shower daily if they wanted. After years of cold water buckets and monthly delousing, unlimited hot showers seemed like impossible luxury. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber from Hamburg stood under scalding water for 20 minutes during his first shower. The heat penetrated muscles that had been tensed for 3 years straight. Steam filled his lungs. Soap actually produced lather instead of slimy residue. He scrubbed his skin until it turned pink, trying to wash away the accumulated filth of Africa and Italy and the long sea voyage. When he finally emerged, an American guard handed him clean clothes. Not the lousy, threadbare uniform he'd worn for months. Fresh cotton undershirts, wool trousers without holes, a jacket that fit. Socks without holes, even underwear. Laundry twice a week, the guard explained in decent German. You get 2 sets of everything. Keep 1 set clean. Weber stared at the clothing in his hands. His division in Italy had received 1 uniform issue per year. Soldiers wore the same clothes until they rotted off their bodies. Laundry meant cold streams and harsh lye soap that destroyed fabric. And here, in an enemy prison camp, he was getting better treatment than his own army provided. The barracks completed his disorientation. Wooden buildings with real beds, not bunks stacked 4 high, but individual cots with mattresses, clean sheets, wool blankets without lice, electric lighting, coal-burning stoves for heat, windows with glass instead of boards. The barracks weren't luxury housing by any means, but compared to frontline conditions or Soviet camps, they resembled resort hotels. Dinner on that first night destroyed everything German prisoners thought they knew about captivity. The mess hall at Camp Concordia seated 300 men. German POWs filed through a serving line, holding metal trays while American cooks loaded them with food. Real food, abundant food, hot food that actually smelled appetizing instead of vaguely threatening. Roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, coffee, chocolate pudding for dessert. Werner Burkhardt, the Luftwaffe pilot, stared at his tray in shock. This was more food than he'd seen in a single meal since 1941. His hands shook as he carried the tray to a table. Around him, 300 German soldiers sat in stunned silence, looking at their dinners like they'd been handed bars of gold. "It's poisoned," someone muttered. "Has to be." But the American guards ate from the same serving line. Same food, same portions. They sat at separate tables, laughing and talking, completely unconcerned. One guard noticed the Germans' hesitation and grinned. "What's wrong? Not hungry?" Burkhardt cut a piece of roast beef. The meat was tender, properly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. He put it in his mouth. The flavor almost made him weep. Real beef, not horse meat, not mystery sausage made from sawdust and gristle. Actual, honest-to-God beef that tasted like his mother's Sunday dinners before the war. Around him, men started eating. Slowly at first, suspicious and afraid. Then faster as their bodies recognized real nutrition. Some men cried while they ate. Others ate mechanically, faces blank with shock. A few couldn't eat at all, their minds unable to process the disconnect between expectation and reality. The portions weren't unlimited. Guards explained the rules. Take what you want, eat what you take, no waste. But men could return for seconds if food remained. Coffee was unlimited. Bread was plentiful. By Wehrmacht standards, this wasn't prisoner food. This was officers' mess quality. Maybe better. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt from Munich finished his dinner and immediately felt guilty. His friends were starving in Russia. His family faced rations in bombed-out German cities. His comrades died in muddy Italian foxholes while eating moldy bread. And here he sat in Kansas, eating roast beef and chocolate pudding in an American prison camp. The psychological impact couldn't be overstated. Food represents survival at the most basic level. When your enemy feeds you better than your own army ever did, every assumption about that enemy crumbles. Propaganda calls Americans weak and decadent. But weak nations don't feed prisoners steak while their own soldiers eat K-rations. Decadent nations don't operate 650 prison camps with such bureaucratic efficiency that not one falls below Geneva Convention standards. Meals continued 3 times per day. Breakfast meant eggs, bacon, pancakes, oatmeal, toast, coffee. Lunch brought sandwiches, soup, vegetables, fruit when available. Dinner rotated through various meats: beef, pork, chicken, occasionally fish. Fresh vegetables appeared regularly. Milk was plentiful. Desserts came with most dinners. American soldiers at the camps ate the same food. No special provisions for guards versus prisoners. Everyone got the same quality and quantity. This detail impressed German POWs more than almost anything else. In Wehrmacht camps, guards always ate better than prisoners. Always. The hierarchy of suffering was maintained through food allocation, but Americans seemed to consider prisoners worthy of the same nutrition as their own troops. Camp Hearn in Texas had a particular reputation among transferred prisoners. The camp bakery produced fresh bread daily. German bakers, working as prison labor, created rolls and pastries that reminded men of home. The Americans provided flour, yeast, sugar, and butter without restriction. Quality mattered more than cost. The resulting bread products exceeded what most German soldiers had eaten even in peacetime. Weight gain became visible within weeks. Men who'd arrived skeletal and malnourished began filling out. Hollow cheeks rounded, sunken eyes regained normal appearance. Energy levels increased. Chronic health problems improved with proper nutrition. Camp doctors documented the transformations with before and after photographs that seemed almost propagandistic, except they were entirely real. Hans Schmidt gained 30 pounds in his first 2 months at Camp Concordia. His Wehrmacht uniform, issued in 1940 and worn for 3 years, hung loose on his frame when he arrived. American guards laughed and gave him a smaller size. By Christmas 1943, that size was too small. He requested another uniform. The supply sergeant handed it over without comment, making a note in his ledger. For soldiers trained in Nazi ideology about racial superiority and enemy inferiority, the cognitive dissonance became overwhelming. Your mongrel enemies feed you better than your master race leaders ever did. Your weak captors provide medical care your own army rationed. Your decadent jailers treat you with more dignity than your own officers showed. Every meal became an ideological earthquake. The recreation facilities appeared next. Camp Concordia built a movie theater that seated 500. Not a drafty tent with a bedsheet screen. An actual theater with a projection booth, cushioned seats, and a sound system. German POWs watched Hollywood films twice weekly. American propaganda officials carefully selected the films. Nothing overtly political, no war movies showing Allied victories. Instead, comedies, westerns, musicals, dramas. The goal wasn't to demoralize prisoners but to show them American culture. The very culture Nazi propaganda claimed was shallow and worthless. Burckhardt attended his first movie screening with deep skepticism. He expected crude propaganda disguised as entertainment. Instead, he watched The Wizard of Oz. Technicolor exploded across the screen in a rainbow that seemed impossible. The music soared. The story followed a simple farm girl's adventure through a magical land. It was innocent, fantastical, and beautifully crafted. He'd never seen anything like it. German cinema under Goebbels produced heavy-handed propaganda wrapped in thin entertainment. Every film carried ideological messages about sacrifice, duty, and racial destiny. The Wizard of Oz had no political message at all. It was pure escapism, created by a culture wealthy enough to spend enormous resources on entertainment for its own sake. The American abundance showed in every frame: the sets, the costumes, the special effects, the full-color cinematography. Germany couldn't produce films like this anymore. All resources went to war production. But America made movies while simultaneously building the world's largest military. Other camps offered different entertainments. Camp Como in Mississippi built a full sports complex. Soccer fields, baseball diamonds, volleyball courts, even a swimming pool. German POWs organized leagues and tournaments. Guards provided equipment, balls, nets, uniforms. Physical fitness was encouraged. Men who'd been starving months earlier now played competitive sports with enough energy to last full games. Camp libraries stocked books in German and English, not just technical manuals or propaganda. Literature, philosophy, history, science. Prisoners could check out books freely, reading for pleasure during evening hours. Many camps offered English language classes for prisoners who wanted to learn. American teachers volunteered to instruct German soldiers in conversational English, grammar, and vocabulary. Music programs flourished. German POWs formed orchestras and chamber groups. Americans provided instruments: violins, cellos, trumpets, clarinets, pianos. Concerts happened weekly, attended by both prisoners and guards. Weber, the Hauptmann from Hamburg, played cello in Camp Concordia's orchestra. He'd studied music before the war, setting aside his cello when mobilization began in 1939. Now, in an American prison camp, he played Beethoven and Brahms again. The Americans even allowed prisoners to form theaters companies. POWs wrote plays, built sets, designed costumes, and performed for their fellow prisoners. Some camps hosted multiple productions per month. German creativity and talent, suppressed by years of war and military discipline, exploded in these prison camp cultural programs. Art supplies were available. Prisoners painted, sketched, and sculpted. Some camps displayed artwork in dedicated galleries. American visitors toured these galleries, admiring German artistic skill. One camp in New Mexico became known for its murals. German POWs painting scenes from their homeland on barrack walls, transforming utilitarian buildings into galleries of memory and longing. The cultural programs served multiple purposes. They kept prisoners occupied and prevented the psychological deterioration that comes from boredom and despair. They maintained morale and discipline. They demonstrated American values, creativity, individual expression, cultural preservation, and they subtly undermined Nazi ideology by showing prisoners that their enemies valued the same art, music, and literature that Germans treasured. But the programs also revealed something unexpected. Many German soldiers were hungry for culture after years of nothing but military life and propaganda. Young men who'd been drafted at 18 and spent their entire adult lives in uniform discovered or rediscovered artistic interests. The prison camps provided space for personal development that military service never allowed. Schmidt started writing poetry at Camp Concordia. He'd never written anything creative before the war. His education emphasized technical skills and physical fitness. But in camp, with time to think and access to books, he discovered he could express the complicated emotions of his situation through verse. Other prisoners did the same. Camp newspapers published prisoner writing, poems, essays, short stories. Americans provided paper, typewriters, and printing equipment. The newspapers themselves represented another shock. Prisoners edited, wrote, and produced their own publications. American censors reviewed content before printing, but the oversight was light. Prisoners could criticize camp conditions, suggest improvements, debate ideas, freedom of expression within reasonable limits. One newspaper at Camp Herne ran a serialized novel written by a former schoolteacher from Stuttgart. The story followed a German family through the 1920s and 30s, showing how economic desperation and political manipulation led ordinary people to embrace Nazism. It wasn't anti-Nazi propaganda. It was an honest exploration of how totalitarianism takes root. American censors approved it. Over 6 months, prisoners read weekly installments discussing the story's themes in reading groups. The Geneva Convention allowed POW labor under specific conditions. Prisoners could work with certain restrictions: no direct war production, no dangerous conditions, wages paid for labor. The United States implemented extensive work programs across its camp system, putting hundreds of thousands of German prisoners to productive use while maintaining treaty obligations. Agricultural labor dominated. The war had drained American farms of young men. Crops needed harvesting. Livestock required tending. German POWs filled the gap. Work details left camps daily, traveling to nearby farms under minimal guard. Prisoners picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, worked sugar beet fields in Minnesota, picked fruit in California. The interactions with American civilians during these work details transformed German attitudes more than anything else. Prisoners expected hostility. They expected to be treated as enemies and Nazis. Instead, American farmers treated them as workers. Hard workers, yes, but humans nonetheless. Schmidt's work detail went to a farm outside Concordia, Kansas. The farmer, a middle-aged man named William Harrison, owned 600 acres of wheat and corn. His two sons were fighting in Europe, one in France, one in Italy. Harrison needed labor to bring in his harvest. German POWs provided it. On the first day, Harrison watched the prisoners work for an hour. Then he approached Schmidt and spoke through an interpreter. "You boys know farming?" Most did. Many German soldiers came from rural areas. Agriculture was familiar work. The prisoners nodded. "Good," Harrison said. "Do it right, and I'll see you're treated right." At midday, Harrison's wife brought lunch to the fields: sandwiches, fruit, lemonade, cookies. She served the German prisoners the same food she would have given American farmhands. She smiled at them, asked through the interpreter where they were from, whether they had families. Schmidt almost couldn't answer. This woman's sons were fighting Germans like him. Her country was at war with his homeland. But she served him lunch and asked about his family like he was a neighbor's boy working summer harvest. The disconnect shattered something inside him. Over weeks and months, these interactions multiplied. Farmers invited work details into their homes to escape midday heat. Wives served coffee and pie. Children watched the prisoners with curiosity instead of fear. Some farmers learned basic German phrases. Some prisoners learned English from daily conversation. Hans-Jürgen Sorge worked a farm in Idaho. The farmer, a second-generation German immigrant, spoke fluent German. His grandparents had come from Bavaria in the 1880s. He and Sorge spent lunch breaks talking about Germany, comparing the country Sorge knew with the homeland his grandfather had left. The farmer's stories described a Germany before nationalism and totalitarianism, a place of local traditions, family ties, and community bonds. That Germany still exists, the farmer said. Underneath all the war and politics, it's still there. Sorge wanted to believe him. Not all interactions were positive. Some Americans harbored deep resentment toward Germans. Some had sons or husbands fighting overseas. Some had lost family to German military action. Occasional hostility erupted. But even the hostile interactions followed rules. Anger expressed through cold silence or sharp words, never violence or abuse. The system maintained standards. Prisoners earned wages for their labor, 80 cents per day in scrip, usable at camp canteens. The canteen stocked cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing supplies, even beer in some camps. German POWs could purchase small luxuries with their earned money. This detail amazed prisoners familiar with Wehrmacht practice. Soviet POWs used as slave labor received nothing but enough food to keep them barely alive. Some camps allowed skilled prisoners to work in specialized trades: carpenters, electricians, plumbers, mechanics, Men with pre-war professional training could practice their skills. These prisoners earned higher wages and worked under minimal supervision. The Americans valued competence over security concerns. Skilled labor was too valuable to waste through excessive restriction. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, German POWs built and repaired military equipment. Nothing classified or directly combat-related, but logistics work, vehicle maintenance, equipment repair, construction projects. The work was supervised but not heavily monitored. American officers trusted German professional pride to ensure quality work. That trust itself became a weapon against Nazi ideology. You don't trust inferior enemies with important work. You don't respect mongrel race mixers enough to let them work unsupervised. But Americans did both. The respect implicit in that trust communicated more effectively than any propaganda could. In dozens of small towns across America, something remarkable happened. Civilian families invited German POWs to Sunday dinner. Not officially, not as organized programs, just farmers and townspeople who'd worked alongside prisoners and decided to extend American hospitality. Schmidt received his first invitation in October 1943. The Harrison family invited him and 3 other prisoners to their farmhouse for Sunday dinner after church. The guards approved it. No armed escort. Just 4 German soldiers walking up a gravel driveway to an American family's home. Mrs. Harrison had prepared a feast: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, green beans, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. The family's 3 daughters set the table with their good china. Mr. Harrison said grace in English. Everyone ate together, American family and German prisoners sharing a meal around a dining room table. The conversation flowed awkwardly at first, filtered through the limited German Mr. Harrison remembered from his own father. But food transcends language. The meal's quality spoke clearly. You are guests in our home, and we honor guests properly. After dinner, they sat on the porch. Mr. Harrison smoked his pipe. Mrs. Harrison served coffee. The autumn Kansas skies stretched overhead, stars emerging as daylight faded. And for a few hours there was no war. No enemies, no prisoners, just people sharing an evening. Schmidt struggled to process the experience. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as materialistic individualists with no sense of community or honor. But this family invited their son's potential enemies into their home and treated them with generosity and respect. The disconnect between ideology and reality couldn't be bridged. One had to be true and the other false. Schmidt was beginning to understand which was which. Similar scenes played out across the country. A Wisconsin family invited German POWs to their farm every Sunday throughout 1944. They had lost a son at Normandy, killed by German artillery. But they still invited German prisoners to dinner because, as the mother explained, those boys are somebody's sons too. Not every community welcomed prisoners. Some towns resented their presence. Some Americans protested the apparently comfortable conditions. Why are we feeding Nazis steak while our boys eat rations? Fair question. The answer: reciprocity for American POWs in German camps seemed insufficient to people who'd lost sons and husbands to German weapons. But the protests never escalated to violence. American military police maintained order. Camp commanders defended their policies. The system continued operating according to Geneva Convention standards despite local opposition. By 1944, the psychological impact of imprisonment in America was reshaping German prisoners' worldviews on a massive scale. The evidence surrounding them contradicted Nazi ideology at every turn. Nazi propaganda claimed Americans were racially inferior, but prisoners watched black soldiers serving as guards, truck drivers, and camp staff, performing jobs with competence and discipline that matched or exceeded Wehrmacht standards. The cognitive dissonance forced questions that had no safe answers. If black soldiers were inferior, why were they so effective? And if they weren't inferior, what else had Goebbels lied about? Nazi propaganda claimed Jews controlled America and ground its people into wage slavery. But prisoners saw American prosperity at every level: farms, towns, cities. They saw civilian abundance that exceeded anything in Germany even before the war. If Jews were oppressing Americans, the oppression produced strange results: wealth, freedom, and opportunity far beyond what Aryan Germans experienced under Nazi rule. Nazi propaganda claimed Americans were weak, spoiled, and unable to fight. But German soldiers had surrendered to American forces. American industry produced war materials in quantities that seemed impossible. American agriculture fed its population, its military, and its prisoners without apparent strain. Weakness doesn't conquer half the world while treating its enemies to steak dinners. Every assumption crumbled under observation. Weber, the Hamburg Hauptmann, had been an early Nazi Party member. He'd believed in the cause, truly believed in German racial superiority, and the right to dominate Europe. 3 years in American captivity destroyed that belief through the simple power of observable reality. He watched American efficiency: trains running on time, camps operating smoothly, bureaucracy functioning with mechanical precision. He saw American abundance: food, medicine, resources allocated without apparent limitation. He experienced American restraint: power used proportionally, violence contained, rules followed even when breaking them would be easier. This wasn't a weak or decadent nation. This was a superpower barely trying, achieving victory through resource advantage so vast that it could simultaneously crush its enemies and treat prisoners humanely. Fighting America had never been a realistic option. Germany was doomed from the moment Hitler declared war. Every death since then was pointless waste. The realization made him physically ill. He'd killed men for a cause that was lost before it began. Friends had died believing they fought for something meaningful. German cities were being destroyed for a regime that had lied about everything from racial science to military capabilities. And he'd helped. He'd believed. He'd led men into battle for a fantasy. Not all prisoners reached these conclusions. Hardcore Nazis remained committed to the ideology despite evidence. They formed cells within camps, attempting to maintain discipline and belief among wavering soldiers. These true believers caused problems: threats against prisoners who questioned Nazi doctrine, kangaroo courts for defeatism, occasional violence against traitors. Camp commanders isolated the hardcore Nazis when possible, transferring them to separate facilities. The U.S. Army identified and segregated the most committed ideologues, recognizing that denazification would fail with this small percentage. But for the majority of prisoners, young men conscripted into military service, ordinary Germans who'd believed their government's propaganda, the evidence of their own eyes was demolishing their belief systems. In 1944, American military officials implemented formal re-education programs at select POW camps. The goal: prepare German prisoners for return to a democratic Germany after the war. The methods: education, discussion, and exposure to democratic principles. Camp Concordia became a pilot site. Military intelligence officers selected prisoners who showed openness to alternative political ideas. These men attended classes on American government, democratic theory, German history before Nazism, and economic systems. The classes weren't mandatory. Attendance was voluntary, but hundreds of prisoners attended willingly. The instructors were careful. Heavy-handed propaganda would backfire. Instead, they presented information and encouraged discussion. What is democracy? How does representative government function? What happened to Germany between 1918 and 1933? What alternatives exist to totalitarian rule? Schmidt attended every class. He'd never learned this information. German education under the Nazis presented only one narrative. The November criminals betrayed Germany in 1918. The Weimar Republic was weak and corrupt. Only National Socialism could restore German greatness. Now, American instructors presented alternative interpretations. Germany lost WWII militarily. Democratic government faced impossible economic challenges. Nazis manipulated public fear to seize power. Which version was true? Schmidt didn't know anymore, but he was beginning to understand that truth was more complicated than propaganda suggested. The re-education program included films documenting Nazi atrocities. In early 1945, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps, footage reached American POW camps. Camp commanders showed the films to prisoners, not as punishment, as information. The camps showed Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, mass graves, gas chambers, survivors who looked like walking skeletons, American, British, and Soviet soldiers filming everything, documenting the industrial scale of Nazi mass murder. Many prisoners refused to believe the footage was real. They claimed it was propaganda, staged by Hollywood to demonize Germany. But the films were raw military footage, unedited and brutal. No production values, just cameras documenting atrocities as Allied soldiers discovered them. Some prisoners walked out of screenings. Some wept. Some sat in shocked silence, unable to process what they were seeing. A few insisted the victims were enemy combatants or criminals who deserved punishment. But most prisoners began asking difficult questions. Did we know? Could we have known? What did we fight for? Weber watched the Buchenwald footage in horrified silence. He'd known about concentration camps. Everyone in Germany knew they existed. But the official story claimed they were re-education facilities and work camps for political prisoners and criminals. This was something else entirely. This was systematic extermination on an industrial scale. He'd fought for this. He'd worn the uniform of a regime that built factories for killing humans. The realization broke something fundamental inside him. There was no coming back from this knowledge, no way to rationalize or justify it. Germany had committed crimes beyond comprehension, and he'd been part of the system that enabled them. Not all prisoners reached this conclusion. Some maintained denial. Some shifted blame to leaders while insisting ordinary soldiers bore no responsibility. Some acknowledged the atrocities but claimed they were justified by wartime necessity or enemy provocations. Human psychology finds ways to avoid unbearable truth. But enough prisoners were affected to create what American officials hoped for. A generation of Germans who understood democratic values and rejected totalitarian ideology. These men would return to Germany after the war, carrying knowledge and experience that might help rebuild their nation on new foundations. By 1945, many German POWs had lived in American camps for 2 years or more. The initial shock had faded into routine. Men adapted to circumstances that once seemed impossible. Camp life became normalized, not home, but familiar enough to be predictable. Prisoners maintained military discipline in modified form. They elected camp spokesmen to communicate with American commanders. They organized their barracks, formed work details, created social structures. German efficiency and organization persisted even in captivity. Americans generally didn't interfere as long as prisoners followed camp rules and Geneva Convention standards. The guards and prisoners developed complex relationships. Not friendship exactly. The power imbalance prevented that. But mutual respect emerged in many cases. Guards learned German phrases. Prisoners learned English. They shared cigarettes, talked about sports, weather, food, families. The guards were mostly older men or 4F classification soldiers deemed unfit for combat. They had no particular animosity toward German prisoners. It was a job. Some prisoners didn't want the war to end. Repatriation meant returning to a destroyed Germany with uncertain political future. At least in American camps, food was guaranteed, housing was stable, and they were safe from bombs and bullets. The psychological impact of preferring captivity in an enemy nation to freedom in your homeland was profound and troubling. Schmidt admitted this to himself only reluctantly. He wanted to see his family again. He missed Munich, his friends, the life he'd known before the war. But returning to Germany meant facing the ruins of everything he'd fought for. It meant confronting the crimes committed in his nation's name. It meant rebuilding from absolute zero with no certainty about the future. At Camp Concordia, he had 3 meals daily, a warm bed, medical care, and time to read, write poetry, and play soccer twice a week. His moral accounting was troubling, but his physical circumstances exceeded anything he'd experienced since 1939. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. German prisoners in America learned of Hitler's suicide and unconditional surrender through camp newspapers and radio broadcasts. Reactions varied wildly: relief, despair, anger, resignation, or strange emotional numbness. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, others mourned. Most seemed simply exhausted. But the war's end didn't mean immediate release. Repatriation would take time. The logistics of moving 425,000 prisoners across the Atlantic required months of planning and execution. Additionally, Germany was in chaos. Food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, millions of displaced persons. Returning POWs immediately would worsen the humanitarian crisis. So German prisoners stayed in American camps through 1945, then 1946. They listened to news about Germany's occupation, denazification, the Nuremberg trials. They learned about the Marshall Plan and Reconstruction efforts. They absorbed information about the new Germany being built from the ashes of the old. Repatriation began in earnest in 1946. Prisoners were screened by military intelligence. Hardcore Nazis were flagged. Ordinary soldiers were cleared for return. The process was imperfect but systematic. Americans wanted to avoid sending dangerous ideologues back to a vulnerable Germany while rebuilding democratic institutions. Schmidt boarded a transport ship in New York Harbor in February 1946. He'd spent 28 months in American captivity. He'd gained 35 pounds. He'd learned